From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible of Change. We have a really special program today as we look upon this period of change. And we have a really special guest. Today we're going to talk about the role, the kind of change that occurred in Montana that was done on behalf of Montana's workers. The political changes, the governmental changes that took place in the labor movement. And our special guest here today is, I'm in the interest of disclosure, is for 46 years a dear friend of mine, a mentor of mine, a friend of mine to this very day, Jim Murry of the Montana State AFL-CIO. And we've had enough history together that I want to say that we've made an agreement about a number of things that we will not talk about on the air. Now, I want to say, in terms of Jim Murry and this period of change, remember we're looking at the change that took place between 1965 and 1980. That's the crucible of change period. A dramatic progressive change in the state of Montana. And in that period, at the conclusion of that period, in 1982, the Lee newspapers did a survey of 100 Montana leaders. They selected 100 leaders and they asked them the question, who are the top 5 most influential people in the state of Montana? And they didn't give any names, they just open-ended. Who would you name as the top 5? And as a result of that, they ran a series in the newspaper of who the top 5 most powerful people in Montana was. So obviously we're speaking about this whole period we just went through in the crucible of change. And perhaps to no surprise, the #1 most powerful person in the state of Montana that was declared by those leaders in 1982 was Governor Ted Schwindin. But the #2 most powerful person in the state of Montana in that 1982 survey was Jim Murry. And I think that spoke to the involvement and impact of organized labor under his leadership during the period of change in Montana. So Jim, welcome on board.
Thank you, Evan. It's great to be here.
I guess we always say it's just great to be.
That's right. That's right.
Jim, you were the face of labor in Montana during this whole period. I mean, we don't like to personify it, but you represented workers. You represented organized workers, and you represented every worker in a way. Can you tell us about what it was that brought you into the labor movement at the beginning of this period?
Well, Evan, I grew up in Laurel, and I got started in the labor movement there, followed in my dad's footsteps, by the way, because he was a trade unionist. The thing that drove me to the labor movement, was I saw it as a vehicle for needed social change for a lot of people, whether they carried a union card or not. I wanted to be part of that, bringing about that needed change, and got to play that role.
So when you were struggling for change, what kind of change was pent up desire for change was pent up in the workers of Montana as you entered this period?
Well, it was an interesting time because Montana was always one of the most highly unionized states in the nation. We were probably at that time ranked 3 or 4. We were always in the
That
in
was
the top
because
10.
of the high industrialization of the
That's
Anaconda
right.
Company.
And
the unions
everything,
played
we had such a strong union culture in Montana. Everything, just about everything was organized. But at the same time, when I came to Helena, we had some of the worst worker protection laws in the nation. Our unemployment comp and workers' comp laws benefits compared to states like Mississippi and Oklahoma. We didn't have a minimum wage law. We didn't have collective bargaining rights for public employees. We had what was meet and confer. Instead of collective bargaining, it was collective begging. And so part of that change, and the thing that really drove me, was bringing about that change primarily for workers. But it also, as we made the changes in the worker protection laws, the workers' comp laws and minimum wage, unemployment comp laws, as an example, they served people that were not in unions too. They served everybody and raised the standard of living for all workers in Montana. It was an exciting time.
Well, one of the things I recall under your leadership, that labor was always fighting for and believed that what was good for a union worker was good for everybody.
That's right.
And that meant things like strong support for public education.
Always.
At all levels. The clean and healthful environment, or places, it was labor members and other workers who needed places to go fish, hunt, and camp, and needed clean water and needed clean air and so on. So your battle seemed to me to be much bigger than what people perceive in terms of the narrow mission of a labor leader.
Oh, certainly. And as those environmental movements started, we were very strong supporters of changes in the laws to protect people, not only in the workplace, but in the communities. In those communities where there were dirty plants, the communities themselves were dirty. I remember reading about in your hometown of Butte about how the ladies there were thought of to be very attractive because their color was pale. Well, the reason they were pale is they were sick. They were so much arsenic and lead and everything that was being pumped into the air. I can remember there was a chemical plant down at the Garrison Junction. I don't know if you remember that. It put out terrible air pollution. Kids were being made sick. They were having a terrible time with it. Didn't get much attention until the cows started losing their teeth and dying. And that's what made people think more strongly about perhaps we need some changes. And so we were involved in making the fight to change that, to make it better for everybody. Not just workers, but we also wanted it to improve in those plants, because we didn't have very meaningful safety and safety laws either. That came about primarily with the passage of the Occupational Safety and Health Act, and we played a role in that.
So, and today we're going to focus quite a bit on the way this change was done through the political activities in the political world. And probably, even though you focused in and took part in changing laws and that affected the everyday life of all Montanans, your hallmark was the role you played in getting that done through the political arena. You came out of the OCAW, the Oil Chemical Atomic Workers Union, and you worked a refinery in Laurel. But in what year did you come to the State Fed, and in what role?
Arlene and I came to Helena in 1966, and I was the COPE director, and it was my job to
COPE is the political guy.
Committee on Political Education, and so my responsibility was to develop a political program out across the state. That was the year that Tim Babcock was challenging Lee Metcalf for Lee Metcalf's Senate seat, and that was one of the most important elections in the nation.
Think about it in today's terms. That was a sitting senator being challenged by a sitting governor of the
Republican
other
governor,
party.
That's right.
And so that had to be the big ticket race of maybe the decade.
A lot of attention. And we had, and there was some insistence on some changes as to how how labor had participated in political campaigns in the past. I remember Al Barkin, who was a national COPE director, insisted that I spend 20-some days, I don't remember how many, out of each month on the road talking to people and organizing out there. In other words, he made it clear that they didn't want me sitting around in an office talking to people on the telephone. I had to be out there with the troops, and so we changed that approach very dramatically.
So you came as a COPE director. The director of the state Fed, the AFL-CIO, was who at the time?
Jim Umber was the executive secretary of the state AFL-CIO. That was my predecessor.
And so you and he battled through the '66 election, and that's right at the beginning of the crucible of change, if you will. And it was maybe emblematic of what was going to come. I mean, Lee Metcalf's victory meant a lot to the progressive movement in Montana, didn't it?
Oh yes, it meant everything. Not only in Montana, but nationally. Mm-hmm. It was really critical. The other thing we looked at that time was we realized that campaign, the Metcalf campaign, was going to have a tremendous impact on legislative races, for example, and on the congressional races at that time. So we melded all of those activities in voter registration, get out the vote efforts. And gosh, I can remember in the Great Falls, we'd set up telephone banks. I think we had 25 or 27 telephones and telephone banks in a COPE headquarters in Great Falls, and kept those phones manned. We had those worked on those phones from the primary election through the general. So that took tremendous number of volunteers. It was all done, all of the work was done by volunteers. And it was a great outpouring of support to bring about the change that we're talking about that came during this.
And in that election, in addition to the Lee Metcalf victory, which was obviously one that excited everyone, Arnold Olson was reelected to Congress.
That's right.
There wasn't a governor's race. And in the Eastern District, there was a challenger to Representative Batten by the name of John Melcher, who surfaced later.
That's right.
And I think it was kind of an indication of the future a little bit. Now, all of a sudden, we started moving up toward 1968.
And by the way, John Melcher, you might remember, served in the legislature before that, and had a legislative career here in Montana.
And Mayor of Forsyth.
That's right. That's right. I forgot about that.
You know, we'll be having some programming on John Melcher and his role.
Great.
So we move on to '68, but before we do, let me set a little tone for the '68 election, because in the 1967 legislature, where you were obviously up here working, the big battle royale was over the sales tax. Jim Felt, the Speaker of the House, brought the sales tax up and pushed and pushed and pushed, and the fight in the Senate against it was Senator Gene Mahoney. Can you discuss that and a little bit about how that affected the look at the race for governor 2 years after that, or a year after that?
Gene Mahoney was really a kind of a hero of those in the labor movement. He had a very distinguished legislative career, always made the fight for workers on worker protection laws, but also in that sales tax fight that you're talking about. So what that did is that set the tone for us going into the gubernatorial election when Gene Mahoney faced Forrest Anderson in that primary election. And Forrest was a friend too. He was a friend also. But our support, for the most part, went to Gene Mahoney. I had some friends that were kind of distressed about that, as was Forrest Anderson was upset about that and let me know about it.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in just a second, but it's interesting looking at that race that Forrest Anderson ran and Gene Mahoney ran, and those are the two that everyone remembers, but of course the Western District, Forrest ran and Leroy Anderson popped up.
Yes.
out of Conrad and ran as well, and Willard Fraser ran.
That's right, from Billings, Willard Fraser from Billings.
Yeah, but out of that, Forrest won the primary, and you're telling me that most of labor kind of threw in with Mahoney because of the sales tax and other things he did in the legislature.
That's right, and we didn't have any money. Everything we did was with volunteers, and we were developing the ability to put more volunteers on the street than anybody around, and they really responded. Workers really responded well on jobs all across the state of Montana. So it was a fairly close election, but as Forrest told me, he was going to kick my ass.
Now he won. It was fairly narrow. It was about 30, about 4% difference between them, and they were way ahead of Leroy Anderson and way ahead of Willard Fraser. So obviously now there's a nominee of the Democratic Party that most of organized labor, including yourself, had not actively supported in the primary. What happened?
You know, and the funny thing about that, we really felt that Forrest was too close to the Montana Power Company. That was one of the issues that we talked about all the time. But Forrest was able to win that. And the thing I remember and it was really a delight. Forrest called me, and because he'd been Attorney General, and we were friends. We talked to each other. Forrest called me and asked me to come to the 4Bs. He wanted to meet with me. This was right after the election, and so I went down to the 4Bs, and we sat down together. And he looked at me and he said, "Well, I told you just what I was going to do. I was going to kick your ass." And he said, "Now what are you going to do?" And he looked at me just like that. "Now what are you going to do?" I said, "We're going to be the most supportive organization you have behind you in your race for governor." He said, "Do you mean that?" And I said, "You're damn right I mean that." And so we went from there, and we were, and we fulfilled that promise.
Now, that brings us to that general election in 1968, and the core issue of that election, I think it was, somebody tells me it was our friend Jim Graff, who was working for Bob Henkel at the time, came up with those 4 words to suggest to Forrest.
Pay more, what for?
Pay more, what for?
Interesting, too, Jim Graff and I went to school in Laurel. We grew up together. He was a couple of years ahead of me in school, but we played football and baseball together.
And don't we always say that Montana is a small town with really long streets? We all seem to know each other.
Well, and related, and most of us are related.
Yeah. Now, so pay more what for came to the fore, and in essence, that was the crux of the election with Babcock and Anderson, and Labor went right in there, obviously very strongly, huh?
Well, we had a very strong position in favor of fair taxes and sales taxes. The sales tax was clearly unfair to workers and to low-income people, and that was the state.
It shifted taxes.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
From business to
and
little
people of wealth to middle income and low income people. And
that, of course, ended up being the premier political battle of that whole era, and it did set the tone for a lot. But when Forrest was elected, and he was elected by a fairly substantial margin.
Yes.
By 12
in the
percentage
general
point
election,
in the general election, when he was elected over Babcock, it was like a 12 percentage point win. That was a lot. It kind of put the sales tax to bed for a little while. So when the '69 session hit, they didn't bring up the sales tax, having just kind of suffered through it, and it wasn't in the forefront. There were a few other things that happened in '69. But the interesting political thing that emerged out of '69, and I think we could do a whole show on the rest of the '68 election, which had to do with the Democratic Party in Chicago and Hubert Humphrey and all that, and we might even do a show on that. But was that when Richard Nixon was elected president, he immedately upon going into office in late January had to name some district judges, and he named Jim Batten to be the federal judge in Montana, which opened up the Eastern District congressional seat. And here was an opportunity in a special election for the grassroots empowerment of people to show itself. That was what was happening in a lot of cases on things. People were feeling very empowered and very active on a lot of fronts. Suddenly we had a special election in June of 1969. Can you reflect on that and labor's role in it?
Well, in that, the Montana AFL-CIO became very involved in that campaign supporting John Melcher, and you might remember that his win was by a fairly narrow margin, almost by the absentee ballots that were cast, and we mounted probably the most aggressive absentee ballot campaign ever before in the history of the state, and it was very, very successful. But it was a hard fought campaign.
And that was in June of '69.
Yes.
He had come out of the legislature, and he went into a nominating convention among the Democrats.
Over in Lewistown. Yes.
Yeah, in Lewistown, as I remember. And there's some pretty interesting names ran against him, but but he emerged, and he had a seatmate in the legislature who went over there into the eastern Montana from Butte to help out with the election. Do you remember who that was?
I think that was a guy by the name of Pat Williams, wasn't it?
Geez, you never know where it's funny how all this kind of emerges and everything else.
That's right.
And when John was, by the way, and there's a continuum to it all in a sense that Pat went to Congress to be the top aide to Melcher, and it simply whetted his appetite for wanting to be a member of Congress, which he later was for 18 years.
That's right.
So the story goes on.
That's right.
And on and on. Now, now we end up with the 1970 election, and one of the what came out of that was it was a bad news in the sense that our friend Arnold Olson got beat, and the Western District, which was highly Democratic, suddenly had a Republican. It was Dick Shoup, who was the mayor of Missoula.
That's right.
But you know, there's a lot of stuff going on, the '70 election. But the big thing was when it was over, and the legislature met, the sales tax rose back up again, and that became the kind of premier political battle of the '71 session. Which Alec Hansen recalled for me. Remember, in those days, the legislature met for 60 calendar days under the old Constitution, not legislative days, 60 calendar days. And if they went home for a day, it counted as a day. And if they went to the 60th day and they weren't done with their work, they would stop the clock at 11:59.
Put a shroud over
the clock.
That's right.
And keep working without pay.
That's right. That's right.
And Alex indicated there were 102 days when you counted that session and the special session over the sales tax and the summit committees that were meeting to try to find a solution to the sales tax and the foothills committees, and that they finally ended up deciding to put it on the ballot. And in those days, you could put choices on the ballot, and Forrest Anderson and the Democrats opted for what sounds a pretty radical thing, a 40% income tax surcharge as opposed to a 2% sales tax. And that was the battle, and they decided to put the election, that was late, they decided that in June. They said, well, how do we do this election? Well, we've got this little election for the Constitutional Convention in November.
Delegates, yeah.
The delegates. Why don't we piggyback this? And there's some big history occurred between June and November related to that I think impacted Montana for 2 decades. Can you talk a little bit about
that was really an interesting time. The sales tax supporters who were making the case that their contributions supporting the sales tax came from little old retired ladies and poor people that wanted a sales tax. Well, we knew that wasn't the case. And of course, during all of that, we were able to find the records of the contributors to the sales tax, and it was supported by the major corporations.
It was a very interesting thing, by the way, and just at the personal level, it was during this period in June of 1971. after the legislature was over, and I was involved in the reorganization, executive reorganization effort, including in the legislature, Governor Anderson, through his executive assistant, Ron Richards, and I forgot to ask you about that, and I'm going to come back to that, about the relationship you had there. But they said, we want you to go down and be the executive secretary, it was called back then, of the Democratic Party. So you and I got seriously involved in June of 1971 because the primary opposition to the sales tax was the Farmers Union, the AFL-CIO, and the Democratic Party.
And that was the coalition. That was primarily the coalition, the kind of the foundation for progressive politics in Montana for a long time. So it came together. It had been together, but it really kind of solidified around that issue at the time.
And let me ask you a little bit about that relationship in terms of how it was personified back in 1966 and 68 in your relationship with Ron Richards. Ron, who was then the executive secretary of the party and later the executive assistant to the governor.
Yes. Well, Ron Richards, as you know, was one of my best friends. He was one of your best friends. We all worked together for so many years. I met Ron when he was doing an internship for Lee Metcalf.
Metcalf intern.
And that was even before Arlene and I came to Helena in 1966. I was active in the political things in Yellowstone County and Laurel, president of my local union and all of that. But I was working with Ron even then. And as time went by and we came to Helena, we really worked closely together in the Metcalf campaign when challenged by Tim Babcock. So we confided in each other. We were good friends. Philosophically, we were good friends. Sometimes had some disagreements at times, like especially after he went to work for Forrest Anderson, we had a pretty harsh disagreement over the appointment of the labor commissioner and almost ended up breaking up our families. It was so bad but those things happened. We could have those disagreements. It was an interesting time. We could have those disagreements, feel real strongly about the point we were making at the time, but we knew who our adversaries were and we knew who our friends were. And so we hung on to our friends just as tight as we could. And that was the kind of relationship that Ron and I had. And that relationship continued until he passed away.
Now, so Ron became executive assistant to Governor Anderson once he was elected. And so he was in that position. And after the 71 session, when the sales tax was brought to the fore, and that was the big issue. I mean, it was a big election, and if a lot of people were feeling if the sales tax would have passed, that Speaker of the House Jim Lucas would have been slam dunk for governor.
That's right.
And it was kind of an interesting period, and there was a major group formed called SOS, Save Our State, which purportedly was filled with little contributions from little old ladies. But they had a lot of money to promote a sales tax, and everyone thought that it was
a little more than they would be able to raise from little old ladies.
But there was a lot of denial about where that money was coming from.
Yes.
It turned out it was from all the corporate interests, the big giant corporate interests.
And we were able, working together, we were able to disclose where those contributions were coming from.
Yeah, now and I remember the day, and this goes to the issue, you always were such a hard worker. You always worked harder than anybody else ever worked. And you drug people along behind you, and you shamed them into working harder. If you were not up at midnight with your lights on in your office, then you were going to get a call from you the next morning and say, "Why were your lights off?" You know, it was midnight, I drove by, and your lights were off. And
on vacation?
Yeah, and so you always drove people to that. And so on a day, and I believe it would have been Columbus Day, when everyone else had the day off. It was a public holiday. And
That's right.
You and I and COPE Director Ernie Post were sitting in your office, and we were joined by two people, Gordon Bennett and Duke Crowley.
Duke Crowley, that's right.
And we were sitting around just BSing, and we were saying, and Harry Billings.
That's right, Harry Billings.
Harry was the head of the group called COST, Citizens Opposed to Sales Tax.
Harry had been the editor for the People's Voice, and when we had to shut the People's Voice down, I was on that board when we shut it down. Then Harry went to work for the Liquor Control Board for a while, and I talked him into leaving there and coming over and going to work for us at the AFL-CIO.
So he ended up moving into COST, C-O-S-T, Citizens Opposed to Sales Tax. Now, for our listeners, People's Voice was an independent weekly newspaper for progressive thinkers in Montana that was big in a time when the Anaconda Company owned virtually all of the press in Montana.
And it was supported, the People's Voice was supported primarily by that coalition of people that we were talking about earlier. It was trade unionists, the Farmers Union, the members of those organizations, and the Democratic Party.
So we're sitting around, Harry and Ernie and you and me, and suddenly Duke and Gordon are there. And we kind of raised the question, well, wouldn't it be nice if we knew where this money was coming from? And I can't remember if it was Duke or Gordon, but one of them said, you know, in the old 1912 Corrupt Practices Act that was passed by an initiative of the people of Montana, the very act which was recently thrown out by Citizens United, by the way.
Right. That's right.
There's a provision that says the treasurer of one political party has to open their books up to the treasurer of a competitive political party.
And I think that was Duke Crowley that made that argument, but Gordon was somewhat familiar with it.
And so they went off and grabbed the law books and came back and showed us the law, and we said, well, that means Harry Billings gets to go look at the books of SOS. And Harry started the next day, he started knocking on the door of SOS asking for their books. And they kept not answering it, and finally he got the sheriff to go with him, and we knew the sheriff, and they still weren't going to do it. And then he brought Dan Foley. Dan Foley was an investigative reporter with the Lee newspapers.
And grew up in Laurel, by the way.
Another Laurel connection. No kid, it's all Laurel. And so Harry walked up to the doors of SOS with Dan Foley there, and the treasurer of that committee was a guy named Ken Nybo. And the lady answered the door, and Harry said, "Where are your books?" And she said, "I don't have them." She said, "Well, where are they? I need to look at them. The law says I should be able to look at them." The reporter is sitting there taking all notes.
Ken Nybo had them.
Well, Ken Nybo has them. Well, where's Ken Nybo? He's hunting. I have never forgotten the next day the big story in all the Lee newspapers of Montana.
And the front page story
started the following way: "Oh where has Ken Nybo gone? Oh where can he be? He's off in the hills a hunting with the books that no one can see."
That's right.
And it set the tone. The big question was, well, what's with these hidden books? And of course, a mystery always interests people politically. And you remember that Arnold Olson, who is now an ex-congressman, was kind of had some time on his hands. And he wasn't a judge yet. And on behalf of SOS, he went to file a suit in Victor Falls Court.
And we didn't have any money to pay anybody.
So Arnold said, "I'll do it," and he went and filed a suit in Victor Falls Court. And Victor Falls said, the district judge set a show cause hearing that said, "You shall show up with the books on a given date, or show cause while you should not." And the date he set was the day before the election. And then there's an ensuing story that unfolds on that thing. But let's jump back a little bit to the debate about the sales tax. How many times did you go out and give speeches on that? Would you
gosh, we just lived on the road. We lived on the road talking to. I spent most of my time with workers and at local union meetings and council meetings, things like that. But we all just literally lived on the road during that period.
It thrust me into the forefront of having to deal with this stuff politically. I was wet behind the ears, but all of a sudden I'm standing up as if I'm an authority on the sales tax and rabble-rousing the troops. And
we all became tax experts.
Yeah. And by gosh, for 20 years thereafter, I had a high degree of interest in taxes, maybe 30 years in front of the legislative committees, and actually thought I knew what I was talking about. Now, Clyde Jarvis did the same thing with the Farmers Union, and that was Clyde before he had his toupee, right?
That's right.
Clyde was well known because the Farmers Union had a presence on the radio.
Well, but Clyde had been, remember, Clyde had been a PR guy for the Farmers Union and served in that capacity, I think, when Leonard Kenfield was the president. And then, you remember, Leonard was killed in the car accident. And we went through a period there of where Gordon Tweet was the president of the Montana Farmers Union. And then as time went by, Clyde ended up as the president of the Montana Farmers Union.
But he had his full-throated voice, and he used to do during the legislature, every day they had a radio program
called Featuring the Facts.
Featuring the Facts. So he was a voice that everyone in Montana knew. So he was out there speaking, and you were out there speaking, and I was just tagging along to try to do this stuff. But remember that interesting thing that happened in Missoula? I learned a lot of things from you, but this was very, very instrumental in this whole battle over corporate money, that eventually Montanans made a decision that corporate money meant corporate influence, and that was bad at the time, and that resulted in the sales tax going down so overwhelmingly. But
and the insistence on transparency for all of this.
Yeah. Well, you know, because it was all hidden. It was all hidden.
That's right.
And so you were prodding the Speaker of the House, Jim Lucas, to reveal if he was involved in this and if the corporations were involved in this SOS, and they kept saying, no, it's not us, it's the little old ladies and so on. And one day I went to KGVO television over in Missoula, and a gentleman there, who shall maybe go unnamed for now.
Probably be better.
At the conclusion of my interview said, would you like to know what's in Jim Lucas's briefcase? And I said, gee, I don't know. And he said, well, maybe if you come back at 8 o'clock tonight. And he said, because we can talk about it. And I said, well, okay. I come back, and he says, well, Jim was here a few days ago, and he left his briefcase, and it's still here. And so he reached in the briefcase, and he pulls out, and in here are all these letters to the Anaconda Company and the Montana Power Company and Burlington Northern and Plum Creek Lumber, Montana Chamber of Commerce, and all the big corporate
contractors,
the Contractors Association, saying, would you be part of this? So it was, I'll just straight up evidence that all the corporate money was there.
And it was, and also showed a record, as I recall, showed a record of some of the significant contributions that had been made.
Yeah, and you know, we often look back on that and say, but I didn't know what to do with it. I came back and said, Jim, what do you do with these letters? And you said, well, we asked him 10 more times to say no before we reveal the letters, and the letters went out, and it really exploded that race, which I think people thought was a little bit closer till that point, because as long as the...
you know, and the polling wasn't as extensive as it is now, probably wasn't... it wasn't as technical and everything, but as I recall, it was showing us that that was going to be a tough race. We had to fight right up till the last minute. But with all of that, with the not being able to get the records and the denial, the Jim Lucas denial of where the money came from, the whole thing just exploded. And not only did we win in that election over the sales tax, but it impacted the election to the Constitutional Convention.
Yeah, I was going to say that's kind of the thing, the kind of unknown or unrecognized impact of the sales tax on so many things was the impact on the Constitution.
Yeah. But we didn't have any trouble recognizing the impact that had on elections.
Now, and so the election is held in November. Let's, before we get to the results of the election, back up to Victor Falls Court, because all this is happening in the press, and Arnold had filed the lawsuit, and all of a sudden, the day before the election comes, and they have to show up with either the books or say why not. And my recollection is they came with the books and said why not, but they made apparently a little mistake. They took the books and they gave them to the clerk of the court, and they became part of the record. And while they were in there arguing in court, Harry Billings, who knew everybody in Montana and everybody in Montana, was thumbing through the records and finding all the money in there that came from all the big corporations and all the connections and everything else. And next thing you know, all the press people are not in the courtroom. They're standing over Harry's shoulder, and he's saying, look at this, and look at this, and look at this, and look at that. And the next day was Election Day. And on election day, the front page of every state newspaper in Montana said, corporate giants fund the sales tax.
That's right. It was pretty clear.
So everybody who got up to vote saw that and then went to vote. And what was the result of the election? It was 70% plus against the sales tax.
Overwhelming, just overwhelming.
And it had an impact, even though there was a really, really good group of progressive people interested in good constitutional change. It was a partisan election. It ended up being an election where the sales tax vote kind of tipped the playing field.
Oh, it really, I don't think it kind of did. I think it did just very, very significantly. That really had an impact.
So you ended up, we as a state ended up with electing a constitutional convention that consisted of almost 60% Democrats, and actually, to the credit of those delegates, they were interested in constitutional change.
Oh, they sure
so
were.
there were so many progressive Republicans running in that, as well as a number of independents. So the makeup of that constitutional convention was the next big thing for labor to be looking at. Was suddenly we had a constitutional convention convening.
Well, in this demand, something to remember about that too is this demand for change that had been going on since, in the 60s, and that demand for change just kept building, and the result of that was that there were, you were talking about the progressive Republicans that were delegates. There were a lot of progressive Republicans in the legislature in those days. They could feel that demand and that demand for change, and so they responded to it, and they responded very favorably. But yes, there were some Republicans in the Constitutional Convention that made quite a contribution to the success of that document. But remember too that now you have this divide between Democrats and Republicans, with I think most Republicans not being very supportive of environmental regulations and things like that. And in those days, we had a number of Republicans that stood up for and supported very strongly changes in the laws. Well, at that time, we were enacting the environmental laws, but they played a role. They played a role.
In fact, we're going to feature some of them in
and that's wonderful.
Change. And some of those Republican legislators of the time who were the leaders and the sponsors of the environmental bills.
That's right. That's right.
It's a little hard to see that in today's context, but it's true.
I think that people today, that's a long time ago, and it really is. It's almost ancient history, and people have a very difficult time understanding the Republican role in those changes. But those were good changes, and they did good work. Did some good work.
And when you talk about the pent-up demand for change, which is really what this whole series is about, I think it's good to reflect upon the fact that in a democratic society, people in the political world ultimately, if they can't convince the electorate, the body politic, to go along with them, they end up going along with the body politic. I mean, or you don't stay in office.
That's right.
Now, there's a lot of manipulation of that in the political processes. But that being said, Ted Schwinden said, right after World War II, you came back with people who were becoming enlightened. They'd been around the world. They'd been seeing the world during the war. They came back under the GI Bill. They got educated, and suddenly there was this new perspective on things. Women wanted,
and they had a sense of what could happen if people worked together.
Yeah,
that was another.
Well, you learned that in the military for sure,
yes,
and the impacts of that. And then women were emerging in a big way, and we haven't talked about that.
Right.
And I want to ask you to do it. But there was a demand in the body politic for change. It wasn't imposed upon them. And the question might be, well, what shape would the change be? And when you get to the 1971 session, my recollection was there were 2 women in the legislature, Tony Rozelle and Dorothy Bradley.
That's right. I think that's right.
Am I right on that? If it was more than 2, it might have been.
Well, there was another lady from up in, gee, I'm embarrassed that I can't remember her name, from up in the Kalispell area, I think, that
okay.
had
Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
I
But I don't think she was there that year, but she might have been. But think about that as opposed to with the Constitutional Convention, which had like 20 women, and then the emergence of women's issues through the 70s. What was labor's feel and involvement? Because women always played a strong role in labor.
Well, yeah, and the labor movement, for the most part, was a very liberal, was a very liberal body. Now that we fought, we had a lot of disagreements internally over how we were going to reach gold, but for the most part, it was a pretty liberal body. Liberals, the difference between liberals and conservatives, liberals are always struggling and fighting to bring about change. Conservatives tend to fight to maintain the status quo. And so as women became involved, we not only welcomed that, we encouraged it, and we encouraged union women to participate in the process. They were participating in the process, in the political process out in the field where we were. I mean, they played a very important role with the central labor councils and with local unions. There were ladies that were really giants in the labor movement, and they're great leaders. So it just fell into place that we would be supportive of the women's movement, and the women's movement became very much a part of the coalition that we had formed with groups like the Montana Farmers Union and the Democratic Party, and they became a part. They became a part of that effort, as did the environmental groups.
Now, we move into, after the election of 71 and the con-cons taking place in 72. 72 is an important election year in a lot of ways, one of which was Lee Metcalf was up for re-election again.
Right.
And Lee wasn't feeling well health-wise. He didn't really want to run again. He'd only had 2 terms, but he was not doing well with his health, and he didn't want to run.
He was exhausted.
And yet he was such an impactful senator on the right side of every issue that from a labor perspective, he had to somehow run.
Yes.
Tell us about the efforts to get Lee to run.
Well, that all came down to the convention up in Great Falls, and Lee Metcalf spoke to that convention, and everyone knew that he would be making an announcement
one way or the other.
One way or the other. And boy, that was a desperate time for me. And Lee and Donna had a couple of us come up to the room, the COPE director for the National AFL-CIO at the time, and I up to the room to talk to Lee because he wanted to visit with us about his feelings. And you know, and looking back, I almost feel guilty about the pressure that we put on him, and we really did. We said, Lee, you have to do it. You have to run again. You just have to do that for us. You have to do that for workers, and you have to do it for little people. That was the best way to ever get to Lee Metcalf, because he felt so strongly about people and helping people. But when we left the room, we weren't sure that he was going to announce that he was going to run. In fact, I really thought his announcement would be that he wasn't going to run. He wanted so badly to just come home, and
he was a gardener, and he wanted to just tend his garden. You know?
That's right. And yeah, and he just wanted to be like other people, and he wanted that, and he made such an argument about that. I thought that that he was going to announce that he wasn't going to run.
That speech was in front of about 700 people at the Rainbow Hotel.
That's right. It was at the Rainbow. 7, is that right?
Yeah.
I remember the huge crowd.
Everyone was there to find out what is Lee Metcalf.
And you remember he had 2 speeches.
Yeah.
He had one speech that he was announcing that he wasn't going to run, and the other speech was that he would seek re-election.
I remember how he toyed with the audience.
Well, and he got in. Well, and see what he was
Back and
doing.
forth.
Yeah, but he was using the speech that he wasn't. Remember that he wasn't going to run. And I'm just sitting there. Geez, I'm just perspiring. You know, because I think, oh, it's over. We got to have another candidate. And then when he announced that he was going to seek re-election,
the place
wow,
exploded.
Wow, I'll never forget that. It just exploded.
The irony, of course, in this thing was that he didn't even his health was so bad that he didn't serve out the term. That a year before the end of the term, he passed away.
That's right.
And I think we all felt a little bit of guilt about not letting him get back to Montana to garden enough. But
I think, we all felt guilty about that.
But during that period, again, Lee Metcalf did all kinds of progressive things in the Senate that were a result of his commitment, a big part of which was his commitment to workers, you know, in a big way. I always remember that when he was running, that he was running against Hank Hibbard.
That's right.
And Hank Hibbard was a Republican senator from Lewis and Clark County, and
a Republican state senator.
State senator and Lee had a notorious temper. We used to call him the bull of the woods, remember? You know, and you didn't want to be around when he
I was a recipient a couple of times of his anger.
Yeah.
And I was told that I should take that as a compliment, because Lee Metcalf never picked on cripples. I didn't know if that was really logical or not, but he would let me know his feelings, and
I always remember that he finally agreed to one debate with Hibbard, and the rules of the debate were, it was in Great Falls, the rules of the debate were you couldn't bring notes, but Hibbard walked in and he had a loose leaf notebook that thick with everything he needed to know in it, and he just plopped it down and that was it. And Lee walked in with a paper plate, a round paper plate.
And we had all talked to him extensively about don't lose your temper.
Right, don't lose your temper. That's the only thing that can happen. If you lose your temper on
it's
TV,
over.
But don't. And so he walked out and he had a paper plate. And so through the whole debate, Hibbard was doing all the details and everything else, and Lee would just look down at that plate, and then he would talk about all the stuff that he knew about.
And then, he knew about a lot.
When it was all over, one of our partners walked up and picked up the plate, and you know what it was? It was a smiley face, just a smiley face with the words underneath that says, "Don't let the SOB get you mad."
Yeah, that's right.
And that's all he had in front of him for the debate.
That's right.
So he knew his game, so to speak. But that was a very important election in that sense, and it kept the continuity going in the labor movement for many years to come. The '72 election was Forrest Anderson didn't run, and it ended up Tom Judge. What were your thoughts about the transition, because you had a new governor for the first time, 4 years of a governor you could work with as a labor movement, and now you had a different governor, but there was amazing continuity in terms of the change of governors, but not a big change in the staff.
That's right.
What was your sense of that?
Well, but another thing, you know, we talked about how we all had a relationship with each other. We'd been friends forever, and so as that change came about, it wasn't like all of a sudden we had a governor that we didn't know. He was somebody that had served in the legislature. He was somebody that was part of the Farm Labor Coalition, was very involved with all of that. So we had a real sense of who it was that we're dealing with. But one of the points I want to make about Lee Metcalf, we talked about, you know, how the coalitions came together, and through the years I've been given a lot of credit for developing coalitions and adding to that coalition effort in the state. That wasn't my idea. That wasn't something that I came up with. Lee Metcalf was the guy that developed the coalitions in Montana. The Farm Labor Coalition that was so strong. Lee Metcalf was the engineer of all of that. He was so involved with conservation groups and the environmental groups that all of that came into that coalition naturally. You were asking about the women's groups. See, it all came together. Lee Metcalf was a guy that really understood coalitions, and when I went to work as the co-director for the state Fed, and later became the executive secretary, I spent a lot of time talking with him about how we needed to bring people together. And he always reminded me, we had really tough right-to-work fights in 1953 and 58 in Montana. And we didn't have a lot of money to make the fight, but the reason that we won was because of the coalition, primarily with the Farmers Union at that time. And Lee always said, look, we have to have all the friends that we can get. We have to bring in as many people as we can into our political efforts to be successful. Mm-hmm. And he was so right about that. Mm-hmm. But Ted Schwinden was from that school.
Well, and that's part of the continuity. People like Ted Schwinden, Tom Judge came in and he kept 80% of the department directors.
That's right.
Unheard of. But there was a period in there which we'll go into in a subsequent program, which is that whole period in the 1970s when the political activity resulted in a lot of legislative change in the laws. Yeah. That you were heavily involved in.
And that was a tough time too, because we were going through some really tough economic changes and impacted the labor movement tremendously. We were losing members. There were plant closures, and there were dramatic changes in that regard. Ted Schwinden had to deal with all of that when he was.
He did, and I remember when we had to run over to Butte with Lee when they closed the underground mine.
That's right.
Remember and had the meeting that we had at the Miners Union Hall.
We had the hearing over there. That's right.
And
I remember the thing I remember about that. Lee's health was so bad, and met him over there the night before and talked about the presentation and what we were going to do. And I remember going into the miners' hall, and he had to go up some stairs, and he could hardly make it. Mm-hmm. He was having such a difficult time. He got in there, conducted the hearing, and he came to life. It was an amazing thing to watch.
Yeah, it is. And we're coming to a conclusion here of this hour. There's so much that you, as the second most powerful man in Montana of the period.
That was grossly overstated.
Well, we may want to wonder, did you fix the vote? But no, in all seriousness, there's so much that came out of that period that we haven't dealt with, which is the issue of policies, the issue of the laws that govern Montana, the laws that govern the nation, and what the representatives of workers in this period of change, the difference they made in it. You again played a big role in that, and so as we move forward with this series of In the Crucible of Change, we're going to get back together with you and some other folks to talk about those those specific accomplishments. And they're myriad, but the leveraging point for all of that was the political activity we've discussed today. And you have a heart for politics and a skill for politics that is unmatched in my knowledge.
Thank you.
And again, it's in full disclosure, I'm a real fan of Jim Murry because much of what I've learned about government, politics, and people, I learned at your knee. And it's made a big difference for me. And it really, what you brought to the table, made a big difference in the crucible of change.
Well, thank you, Evan. But remember, too, that there were so many people that contributed to the culture, that with the crucible of change. You were one of those guys. Thank you.